Hey there, I'm Mattea Roach, and welcome to Bookends. Some books have the ability to really disorient you. You've maybe had the experience of sitting down to read on a lazy Sunday, you're curled up in an armchair perhaps, and after several hours you look up from the page feeling a little bit dazed and confused. It's perhaps gotten dark outside without you noticing. You're not really realizing how much time has passed, and it takes you a while perhaps to get back into real life and reorient yourself. That experience of disorientation and feeling a little bit out of place in time is what I felt when I was diving into the work of my guest today, Pasha Malla. Case in point, Pasha's latest novel, All You Can Kill. It's a story that's set at a sinister wellness resort. It uses horror and humor to express the idea that life is strange, people are even stranger, and what makes us human is our drive to investigate and make sense of all of that. Pasha joined me for this conversation at the CBC studios in Toronto. Hey, Pasha, how are you doing?
I'm good, Mattea. How are you?
I'm not too bad. Thank you for making the trek into the office. We really appreciate it.
Oh, it's a privilege to be here.
I want to start off with the opening scene of the novel because immediately we are plunged into a very surreal experience. We start off with this unnamed narrator and his accidental companion floating through the sky, kind of like these human balloons just drifting. And they end up landing and ending up on this desert island, and things kick off from there and only get weirder. I'm wondering what inspired this opening scene for you. Is there anything in particular you were drawing on in crafting this image?
Yeah, the opening scene is, this is a kind of unofficial sequel to my last novel, Kill Them All. And I laugh because the title is so stupid. It was a placeholder title, and then I just kept it because I thought it was so dumb that it was, well, I don't know if it's smart, but it entertained me enough to keep it. And that book ends with these two characters floating up out of the mall. And I wrote that book after having written two novels that took me a combined 14 years. And I wanted to write something sort of quick and dirty and fun. So I set up this scheme where I would write a novel in 12 parts, write one part per month, and then whatever came out would be the finished product. And so that was that novel. I had so much fun writing it that then when, lockdown started in early 2020 and fun was sort of hard to be found, I returned to the voice and the character and just kind of continued the story from where I left off. And the whole plan with these books is that there is no plan. Like, it's really just a kind of, I bore this turn from an Argentine writer I really like, Cesar Ira, who calls it the flight forward, where there's no outline, there's no even like preconceived notions of what you want the story to be. You just sort of follow each action or language or rhythms or imagery. And so, yeah, they were floating and they continued to float, and then they ended up on an island. And then I had to sort of figure out what was on the island. And I really didn't, I know the book is being talked about as kind of, it's about, wellness retreats or whatever. And that was not the intention. I didn't go into this thinking I'm going to satirize wellness retreats. I did go in with this open spirit of just wanting to see what would happen. I mean, it's like this, the ultimate in speculative fiction. It's just like, an open-ended what if question. So yeah, I that's where it began, and then where it went was probably as big a surprise to me as it would be to the reader, I imagine.
I think absurdist storytelling specifically can be challenging for certain readers who like to have a clear box that they can put a novel into. And I found when I was describing to friends, okay, well, what am I reading for work right now? I found myself just sort of describing the events of the book as opposed to being able to summarize it in a sort of neat package of like, this is a book about blank. I'm wondering, when you're writing these absurdist stories that, as you say, were just kind of flowing out of you and you didn't even necessarily know at the outset where things were going to go, do you have to create, are there any rules around that? Like, did you find yourself imposing certain boundaries on where the story would go in order to kind of make it into a book, or did you just really let the creative passion take you where it wanted to go?
Yeah, no, I really just let it go. I mean, if there's any sort of parameters for the book, it's the parameter of like disabusing myself of preconceived notions of what I think a story should be. I mean, I teach creative writing. I'm very aware of, the tropes of traditional storytelling within speculative fiction, within traditional literary fiction, character-driven fiction. And in this novel, the conventions of causality, linearity, even geographic consistency, like the resort is described in ways that are contradictory. Like there's a kind of description of the inside of the resort that is different at the end of the book than it is at the start of the book, which is what I realized upon proofreading. And then I kept it like that. So yeah, the absurdism as a strategy, like an aesthetic strategy or maybe a political strategy, is to me, if I want to be, put on an academic hat and talk about my own work, I mean, it's really a response to a broader culture that I feel like in many ways precludes rational explication, or explanation. Like I go to absurdism the way that, some of the early Soviet writers responded to totalitarianism in the Soviet Union with absurdism. It's a way of undoing the logic, the supposed logic at work, and responding to it in a kind of commensurate strategy. So I guess like that's the serious answer. The other answer is like, I just wanted to have fun. I wanted to make myself laugh. Like my partner will tell you that, she could hear me up in the office, like cackling as I was writing. And that's really, it's not something that is that common for me in my writing practice. Like certainly other books in the book, I just finished another manuscript for a novel. I'm working on another, like they're not joyful in the same way. The joy comes in out of different things. And this was just like a joy of play and invention that I was trying to capture in a way that I felt like was sort of like childlike, like the way that children play with story. And it was fun. It was just like, I was just trying to have fun.
I think the sort of duality of the silly answer, serious answer really does capture what this book does, because there were parts of it that were extremely unsettling to read and quite disturbing. But there were also parts of it that were fun and brought me as a reader back to that sort of childlike place. Like specifically, there are some really incredible, like long lists of adjectives or imaginary titles of things where I was just kind of sitting in my living room chuckling to myself, like, this is a whole page of like nothing's happening in the plot, but this is fun to just read these words put together. I want to talk about the sort of plot insofar as we can describe the plot of the novel. There's this wellness retreat, and specifically it specializes in like erotic couples counseling. And our two main characters are not a couple. They've been thrust into this situation where they are together. They have to pretend like they're supposed to be there, and they are here to work on their relationship. We have this unnamed male narrator. We had a woman named Kay Sohail. As you've said, this is a bit of an unofficial sequel to your previous book, Kill Them All, which also features, I guess, these same two characters. How would you describe the relationship between these two people? Because they're a fascinating duo.
I mean, I think the narrator would have a different version of what their relationship is to what Kay Sohail would say their relationship is. They are, per the marketing copy, accidental companions. They sort of escaped this mall together. They're, physically bound together at the start of the book. And I think they have a sense of sort of duty to one another that is sort of forced upon them by, external circumstances. Yeah, I wouldn't characterize it as like a romantic relationship or even a friendship, but it's just this sort of like two people who are lost in this place together, so they have each other and they need each other. So, not to give away the plot, such as it is, but, they separate and come back together almost by necessity toward the end of the book.
What did you feel you could explore maybe through this relationship that, as you say, is not romantic, not even particularly a friendship? In Kill Them All, they're not even exactly colleagues. Like, they really just are put together by circumstance and then do develop this dependency. What do you think can be examined, I guess, by putting two characters in that situation that's maybe distinct from if, say, the narrator in Case O'Hale had a bit of a deeper connection that wasn't just circumstantial?
Well, it saved me from having to write any sex scenes.
That's one good reason, I suppose.
Thank God. Yeah, I like a book like this, and I think a lot of my fiction, I'm interested in, tensions and in relationships and identities that are like fluid and not easily categorizable, I guess. So, and I find those kinds of tensions really creatively generative. And I think that in this book, I mean, I'm making this sound like this was a really conscientious choice, whereas I think I'm sort of, retroactively interrogating what happened and then how I respond to it creatively. But there's an energy that's created in a relationship you can't define, right? Like, and I think that we find that in our lives, that, you have a certain kind of relationship with a neighbor whose last name you don't know. There's like this proximity and a kind of intimacy, and the way that you have, if your houses are really close together, a kind of like awareness of what their life is like, but yet this distance. And I think that's another kind of relationship I would be interested in exploring in fiction, like something that is like, it's not a romantic relationship, it's not a friendship, it's not family, it's something else. And I think those spaces are, for me, they're really energizing as a space to write into, because it's a sort of thing that I don't understand, and I need to enter the space of fiction to try to figure it out.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of space, I guess, for just development of events ensuing as a result of people colliding together in ways that you wouldn't necessarily expect. I think about this one neighbor that I used to have where I like really knew their habits. I don't think I ever talked to them, but just my bedroom window directly looked into their living room window, and there was no getting around that. And when they moved out of the house and people went in to renovate, I felt kind of sad. I was like, oh, I feel like I've lost something, even though I literally never spoke to these people.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about. That's exactly the kind of relationship I think is it's so dynamic to create fiction. And I think we do, like all of us, will fictionalize those characters in our lives that are just a little bit peripheral to our understanding, and I think all of us have an instinct to go to storytelling to try to understand those relationships. I just do it with typing. Some people do it with thought or conversation.
I'm wondering, we've talked a little bit about the power of absurdist fiction to reckon with some of the true absurd, I would say, horrors of living in the 21st century. I would say that All You Can Kill, to me as a reader, fits into a lineage of satire and a lineage of absurdist novels. But that then begs the question, is there anything in particular that's being sent up in this novel? Because as you said, you didn't set out to write a novel necessarily that was sending up like wellness culture in particular. So looking back now at this piece of work that you've put together, do you think there is a directed critique of anything in particular in it?
No, I really don't. And I think that the book is much more, and I think my work in general has been much more interested in parody rather than satire. And Vladimir Nabokov makes the distinction that satire is a lesson, parody is a game. And I don't have any lessons to teach anybody, but I'm interested in parody as a way to play within spaces and forms, and with tropes. So, I love conventional horror movies. I love them, good ones. There are a lot of bad ones. I'm not interested in satirizing a horror movie, but I'm interested in using some of the tropes of horror to explore dynamics between people, to tell some jokes, to maybe examine some of the excesses and grotesqueries of like late stage capitalism. I'm doing air quotes on the radio, which is not that effective, but imagine the quotes around late stage capitalism. So yeah, it's definitely not, to me, a work of satire in the way that, Jonathan Swift would have written satire, or Orwell or something like that. So yeah, more an instinct toward, games than lessons, I suppose.
I feel like I learned something from that because as a reader of satire, I think I often seek out the work that has a lesson. I want to feel like I've gained a new lens of like, I can now go use this critique out in the world somehow. And I think the distinction of sometimes there is value in just kind of sending things up, but not to make necessarily a point or critique. Like I appreciate that distinction in a way that maybe I hadn't seen before. I'm wondering, are there other authors that you kind of look at as exemplars of doing this kind of parody that isn't necessarily quite satire that you're drawing from in your work?
Yeah, I mean, Cesar Ira, as I mentioned, is among contemporary writers. I don't think there's anyone better. His novels have this incredible ability and fluency with certain genres. And he'll sort of set up all the tropes of, a traditional whodunit, and only to kind of unravel them and maybe challenge a reader a bit about, how our assumptions operate in terms of certain modes of fiction. So Ira, I love. Another contemporary writer whose work I think of as parody is a writer named Diane Williams, who writes these little microfictions that are very strange and very destabilizing. And I think one of the things that is part of her project is like kind of examining the contemporary short story as representative of very specific cultural tropes and references, and kind of interrogating those and sort of revealing the things that many of us who are, middle class, university educated, the sort of traditional audience for the New Yorker kind of short story, that many of the things that we assume to be familiar are in fact like deeply strange and deeply troubling. Gilbert Sorrentino, a wonderful 20th century postmodern writer from New York City. He's a great list maker and a big influence on the lists in the book. And Joyce was an influence on Sorrentino. So there's, I think one tries as an author to participate in these lineages, right? That we're in conversation with all these writers that came before us, who were in conversation with writers before them, and try to in some way participate in that conversation. So I hope I'm coming at it in a way that is honoring those influences and not just like making jokes.
Pasha, we're speaking a bit about lineages in this conversation and the origins of your writing. And so I'm actually curious to hear a bit more about your childhood and your beginnings as a writer. I understand you were born in St. John's, but spent a lot of your formative years in London, Ontario, and also that your parents, I think both were immigrants, like your father from Kashmir and your mom from Great Britain.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah. What was your sort of growing up experience like in terms of your relationship with literature? Was writing something you were doing from early on? Was that something your parents had a relationship with?
Yeah, both my parents are lifelong readers and writers too. They're both very good writers. And we had, it's a classic writer's story, but we had books all over the house we were read to, and I read ravenously as a kid. I was telling someone the other day, I had this, freezer bag, Ziploc bag that was for shower reading. So I could put my book inside the Ziploc bag so I could continue to read while I was showering. I would sneak a book under the table and try to read during meals. And I was always a really avid reader, and I drew a lot as a kid, and just loved stories and storytelling, and wrote my first novel, I put that in air quotes again, when I was like 9 or 10, and it was a Narnia ripoff through and through, just with like brown kids. Mm-hmm. So from a very early age, I was interested in doing this. I had joke that when I was 5, I told my mom that I either wanted to be an astronaut, in a motorcycle gang, or an author. And I wasn't good at science or math, so the astronaut thing was out. And I wasn't very tough, so I couldn't be in a biker gang. So author was a pretty good choice of those three.
Mm. It's interesting you mentioned that this sort of first novel, and I'm going to do the air quotes now too, was Narnia, but with brown kids. Because the one thing I've noticed in your work is you have a lot of characters where they're non-white. It's clear through names and other sort of signifiers that they're not white. But that's not the point or thrust of the story. Like, it's not kind of, I am an author who's writing from a place of having a capital I identity, and this is a book that's about that identity. I'm wondering if you can maybe talk about what your approach has been to writing about race and ethnicity, because that's sort of like, we're just going to tell a story that could be about anybody, but also I'm going to make you know that it's not a story that's only about white people. Feels a little bit like threading the needle, I guess, between two different approaches that maybe are a little bit more commonplace. I don't know.
Yeah, I think so. In Kill Them All, I imagined the narrator of this book to be a sort of Oxford-educated South Asian man of a certain age, certain class, or maybe certain class aspirations. Overly erudite, overly formal, but with a lack of kind of comprehension of what was going on around him. And I wanted that to be implicit in the text and not explicit until there was an audiobook version. And then Anand Rajaram, a wonderful actor, did the audiobook for that novel and did the accent. Because obviously I wanted it to sound how I imagine the narrator of the book to sound in my head. So that fractures the book. There's like two versions of it now, right? That the audiobook is very much identifiable racially, and the text, the paper book or Kindle, whatever, is not. And I think that, this idea that a non-racially identified writer is automatically white is deranged to me. And that if you don't identify the writer as something else, they would have to, by default, be white. I've written many stories where I imagine that the narrators are not white and just I almost facetiously didn't identify them as such, just because I sort of wanted to challenge a reader's assumption. And perhaps I'm talking about a white reader, but maybe not. Maybe I do the same thing when I read. That when a character in a novel, a sort of like contemporary North American novel, isn't racially identified, that they are by default white. So that's sort of part of it. I mean, I did write a novel that was like explicitly about a mixed race character who was like struggling with their kind of identity. And I treated that as parody too. Like, just even that struggle to me feels like a bit of a cliche. And I find many of these questions examined literally in fiction less interesting than examined like ontologically or experientially. That I want to capture maybe more what it feels like to be someone who exists between two firm identities. And rather than narrowing that to be, half Kashmiri and half British, that it's like a feeling of discomfort or a feeling of seeking or a feeling of finding in unlikely places, that I would hope that readers who have shared those experiences from different perspectives might see themselves in. And I think that for me, and I know that there are writers who do the same work, like very explicitly in terms of their racial identity, gender identity, sexual identity. Just for me, I think that I wouldn't be comfortable identifying it so specifically to my own experience. And perhaps that's like a mode of self-preservation or something. But I like more a story that opens up rather than kind of like narrows down.
I mean, yeah, this kind of play, I guess, a little bit with how much of yourself do you insert, how much do readers assume you're inserting, is something that seems to have run through your body of work. Like, I know in your first short story collection, you had a character who shared your first name, but was explicitly not you. And I thought that was such an interesting choice of a first published work to put out there. I've read a number of other authors and also heard some musicians talk about this, where if you are, again, someone who has an identity. That is to say, if you're like racialized, if you're queer or trans, you're assumed perhaps more often to be writing autobiographically, or there's this notion of like, well, you can kind of only write from experience, or you're called upon to write from experience. And so therefore that's like the only thing that you're doing. Is that a pressure or a tension that you felt as a writer at all, that people misattribute certain aspects of your writing to be like, oh, well, this must be something that happened to him?
Yeah, I can speak, really for my own experience, but I have heard and spoken to a number of writers. We've been talking about this, what feels like or can risk feeling like a commodification of one's identity. If it's like part of the package of who you are as a writer and then what the work is. So definitely that's been something that I resisted, and something that I really explicitly resisted in writing that first book. One of the rejections I got from a publisher was something along, and I'm paraphrasing in a cynical way that a lot of time has created in my head, but it was along the lines of something like, isn't he Indian? Why doesn't he write more about that? And it's like, I just found that really dehumanizing, because I thought I just wasn't doing it explicitly and literally. I thought I was very much writing from my perspective, and that was informing everything I was doing. I resist a little bit the possibility of becoming a marketing category.
I feel like you've mentioned you had a lot of fun writing this book specifically. And there's a lot of, I would say, we talked a bit about the play with language that happens in this novel, and you're talking about the sort of lexicon body of things that you incorporate into it. There's a number of different ways in which language is played with, I would say. We've talked about the lists, and sort of there's some like alliterative lists of adjectives and things that show up. There's the robot Jerome, who speaks in this very formalized cadence, almost as though like how telegrams used to be written is kind of like the vibe that I got. He signs off with his name every time. The narrator sometimes speaks a little bit in malapropism. Seems like a very neurotic narrator, I will say, from having read both Kill Them All and All You Can Kill. Like, this man worries like nothing I've ever seen, and just goes on these wild tangents. How do you get into the mode of all of these different kind of syntaxes and patterns of speech? And this seems to me like it would have been maybe one of the most fun things about writing this book, if I'm putting myself in your head.
Yeah, it really was, because Kill Them All was entirely his voice. And I needed in this novel, in this sequel, or possibly second book in a trilogy or kilogy, to get out of his head and bring in other voices. And those voices needed to be equivalent in equivalent caricatures, because he's a caricature. So any other character that came in would have to speak at the same level, at the same pitch, or they wouldn't be heard. So yeah, Jerome speaks in all caps, and, there's this professor, the therapist, who speaks in these long, never-ending paratactical run-on sentences. There's a motivational speaker who just speaks in inanities. So yeah, it was fun to switch between all those voices, but they really had to be calibrated at the same pitch. Otherwise, it just wasn't gonna work. They wouldn't sort of function as operative characters in the novel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was no space for anyone to be subdued. They would have just completely fallen into the background.
Kay Sohail, who is the one who leaves, right? Like, she is the kind of, I don't know if there's a moral compass in the novel, but maybe the voice of reason. And being the voice of reason, she has no place in the novel. She has to get out. So yeah, and I think there could only be one character like that. There couldn't be another one sort of like her.
Yeah, she's sort of voice of reason maybe, although she speaks very little, but seems to be perhaps the only person who has a real clear-eyed grasp of what's going on and understands on some level the absurdity and just the horror of the situation, really in both novels, I would say.
Yeah, and in a book where everybody else is saying way too much, in an attempt to understand what's going on, she knows there's nothing to be said, right? The only possibility is escape.
We've been talking a lot about absurdity, about humor, about horror, but this is also a work that I think, from what we're talking about here, like, we have a character who's kind of seeing things clearly, who has a clear, I would say, like, empathetic core. and on some level is able to recognize some of these things that are going on around her. There's a real sense of like the fragility of human life, I would say, in this work. How do you bring empathy into a work like this that is so kind of like elevated and is such a played up version of the absurdity of real life? It's like amazing to me that there can still be any sort of emotional core in a work where we have like a violent robot who speaks in all caps and people sticking false beards onto their face because they've been inspired by a motivational speaker.
Yeah, there's this wonderful, very short story by Donald Barthelme, the 20th century American writer. And it's just a catalog. It's called On the Deck. And it's describing the deck of a boat that's like a Hieronymus Bosch painting. And it's like, you know, there's a blue Corolla. Beside the blue Corolla, there's a Christian biker gang. Beside the Christian biker gang, there's a girl in yellow stockings. And there's a lion. And it just gets more and more absurd. It's just like this cacophony of imagery. And then toward the end of the story, there's this turn where suddenly a first-person narrator emerges, and you understand that they're sitting on a deck chair looking at what's on the deck of the boat. And it says something like, "You came and sat beside me. It felt so good. We'd never touched before." And the story just ends. And I remember reading this for the first, just this overwhelming grotesquerie of imagery, in which you just lose yourself. And then there's this beautiful turn at the end, like this moment of tenderness, intimacy, touch. And I just remember thinking I want to do this. I want to do this thing where you feel like you're floundering. And then suddenly there's a moment of beauty. And I was just like, isn't this what being a person is like? Especially now that we are inundated with information, imagery. I mean, this is such a cliche of the times to even say these things, but every now and then we can have a human moment, you know? And I think those moments are worth preserving and celebrating. And it's definitely something I wanted to look at in this book, in this, silly, ridiculous book and this silly, ridiculous world that I've created. So yeah, I just think that, if there are any sort of serious considerations in the book, it was that Donald Barthelme story that was in the back of my head, and just remembering how I felt the first time I read it and just being like, this is beautiful, because it comes out of nowhere. It's not saccharine. It's just so honest and human. I think I wanted to try and do something like that.
Yeah, I think it's those moments of serendipity and just real human connection that, for me, make all of the other stuff worth it to get through, right? You can watch the news and completely waste days doom scrolling and feel like things are falling apart and difficult to understand. And it's those moments of profound connection, of being close to people, being in spaces with people, that I think you have to hold on to in order to tolerate a lot of the things that are going on in the world. Pasha, it's been so much fun talking to you. I feel like I learned a lot and understand these books better now, because there were definitely moments where, in a good way, I was very baffled. Thank you so much for coming in and chatting with me today.
Yeah, thank you. The books baffle me too, so don't worry too much.
All right, I'm not alone. That was my conversation with Pasha Malla about his new novel, All You Can Kill. This episode was produced by Ryan B. Patrick with help from Ailey Yamamoto. Our senior producer is Jacqueline Kirk, and our executive producer is Aaron Balser. I also want to shout out our audio techs and the rest of the CBC Books team for everything they do to make this show happen. I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. You can tune in on Sundays and Wednesdays on CBC Radio, or follow the show on the podcast app of your choice. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Because when the book ends, the conversation begins.